In 1995, US intelligence got information that an American source had shared design details about one of America's most advanced nuclear warheads with China. By 1996, the FBI had zeroed in on a suspect. This man, Wen Ho Lee, a nuclear scientist at the Los Alamos National Lab. Despite having his name dragged through the mud and being held in solitary confinement for 9 months, he was never charged with sharing nuclear secrets. In fact, no one was. Why am I telling you this? Between 1984 and 1999, Lee was subjected to 3 separate polygraph tests by the FBI. In one test, the examiners determined he was telling the truth, but FBI officials in Washington later decided he was lying. But should FBI officials have been using polygraphs at all? This case indirectly led the Department of Energy to commission what is still the most extensive study of the science of polygraphs. And what they found is pretty dismal. I'll summarize the report for you, but first let's answer a more basic question. Is it even possible to reliably tell truth from lies? Research on this question goes back more than 100 years, and as we'll see, the answer to that question is actually pretty disappointing. Unless you're a pathological liar. In 2006, researchers looked at data from 206 studies, in total over 24,000 truth or lie judgments. On average, people are only 54% accurate, and in the vast majority of these studies, half the statements were lies, so that was only slightly better than chance. You'd get 50% accurate just by guessing randomly. People were even worse at detecting lies. Their overall accuracy for lies was 47% versus 61% for truths. Quick note, as pathetic as that 47% number is, we might be even worse in real life, where lies are even rarer than half of the statements we hear. If we expect that most of the things we hear are going to be true, then we might let our guard down and let more lies slip by. Now, these numbers were averaged across hundreds of studies, most of which were with college students who were probably bored and just wanted to get it over with and go to lunch or something. But they found that even if you looked specifically at studies that compared non-experts like college students to supposed experts like law enforcement professionals or judges or psychiatrists, there was no difference in accuracy. And a follow-up study from 2014 of about 29,000 judgments found that none of these factors affected people's ability to judge truth from lies either. Okay, so people generally suck at spotting liars, but there is a way to get better. Maybe. It's called the cognitive approach. The basic idea is that telling the truth is easy because all you have to do is recall what happened. But lying is hard because you have to make up an alternative sequence of events and keep it consistent, and that requires a lot of cognitive effort. And if you're interrogating someone, you can make it even harder by adding more cognitive load, by making them recall the events backwards or making them play Tetris while they're telling the story. A 2020 analysis looked at all 23 studies that had tested the cognitive approach up until that point, about 16,000 total judgments. Here's what they found. People's overall accuracy was 60%, 54% for lies, but there was no difference between people who use the cognitive approach and control conditions where they weren't using that approach. So it seems like the cognitive approach doesn't work. But there's more. If you looked at whether people were actually trained in the approach, then there was a difference. People who weren't trained in the approach didn't do much better than chance, but people who were trained in the cognitive approach achieved an accuracy level of about 76%. Okay, so this result is encouraging, but we shouldn't get too excited. First of all, it was based on just 428 judgments from the trained judges, which is a much smaller sample than what they started with. And second of all, there was evidence of publication bias, which means that these results are probably inflated. So where do we stand? At worst, we're no better than chance at detecting lies. At best, with some special training and techniques, we can do better than chance but still make a lot of mistakes. So at this point, it's worth asking, can technology help? What about the polygraph?
Now, Joe thought he could fool the machine. But when the machine showed he was lying, just for fun of course, he readily admitted that the polygraph had outsmarted him.
So let's talk about the polygraph. A polygraph works by measuring a bunch of physiological signals, things like heart rate, blood pressure, changes in breathing. But there's no specific pattern that signals that someone's telling a lie. Instead, people are compared to themselves. First, people get asked control questions that are threatening to honest and dishonest people, like have you ever betrayed someone? Because most people have. These questions set a baseline to compare to the target questions. So when they're asked, did you steal from John? Only a guilty person would feel threatened by that, so you'd expect to see an even stronger response than you would to the control questions. But does it work? Remember the report commissioned by the Department of Energy after the Wen Ho Lee case? In 2003, a group of independent scientists published their findings in a report that was over 300 pages. What they found is that polygraphs have a host of problems that make them highly unreliable. First, the things that polygraphs look for, like rising heart rates and faster breathing, are also signs of fear and stress, exactly the sorts of things you'd expect to see in an innocent person accused of lying. Second, you can mess with polygraphs if you know what you're doing, Like if you deliberately lie on the control questions, it can botch the results. But one of their main conclusions was that the general quality of evidence for judging polygraph validity is relatively low. Why is that? Well, laboratory studies lack high-stakes realism, and in studies of actual interrogations, you can't be sure what the truth is, so it's hard to estimate accuracy. Here's an example. A study from 1978 split prisoners into two groups. One group was told to go into an off-limits room and take $20. Then all the prisoners were given polygraphs, and they got $20 if the tester judged that they were innocent of this mock crime. Overall, they reported 96% accuracy on the polygraph tests. Wow, that's really impressive. I wonder if... Yeah, lots of researchers think results like this are highly inflated. In this study, the polygraph examiner made the guilty decisions himself, so it's possible the results were due to his skill as an observer and had very little to do with the polygraph. Second, the inmates had no real threat of failing the test, like they would in a real-life interrogation. Third, let's be honest, there were only 24 people in each group, which is a tiny sample size. And yes, the study is 50 years old, but honestly, that's pretty typical for research in this area. To be fair, a 2020 analysis of 138 polygraph studies reported an overall accuracy of over 80%. Critics point to the problems and flaws that I've talked about and argue that these numbers are inflated and unrealistic, so the debate rages on. Lie detector machines have been around for about 100 years, and we still don't really know if they work. So what about newer technology? What about automated lie detection using AI? One advantage of AI methods is that they allow for combining lots of different information: video, audio, text, even brain activity. And the latest results are somewhat promising. A 2026 survey of AI models for deception detection found that some models exceeded 80% accuracy. They tended to do better when they were given brain data, suggesting that they might be able to surpass human judgment if they have access to things we can't see. But accuracy went down when they were tested on new data sets, suggesting that they may be over-specialized or over-trained on specific data sets. So like with polygraphs, these results should probably be considered a little overinflated. Why is it so hard to detect lies? Well, what type of lies are we talking about? There's lying about facts, lying about your feelings, lying about your opinions, lies of omission. Lying about a surprise party doesn't seem as bad as lying about cheating on your wife. And sometimes we don't even agree on whether something counts as a lie. Lying seems like a simple concept, but it's really not. Even if there was a way to catch one type of lie, it might not work for another type of lie. Maybe the reason it's so hard to catch lies is because lying is really quite complicated.